in Rochester, which was a very competitive school. And, and he came out as valedictorian. He was a very good student.
Well, Betty and I, were the principals in the house, and very, our money went for rent and food. And Mom said, Gussie asked Dorothy and Julie to be bridesmaids. And I said, Gussie, they can afford everything. How can we afford to have them? She said, reminisced. I will take care of it. Do you know that our mother...
Please don't worry, I'll take care of it.
Well,
she always put a little aside.
From the money that Betty and I gave her to run the house, and neither of us earned fabulous salaries by any means, $13 I think, and maybe $14 kept us going. She, unbeknownst to us, she was a manager of the time. She had put a little aside. She said, I will take care of it. I have the money. Where did you get the money? Don't worry.
In those days, didn't they say that they used to keep money in the...
No, not your mother.
Not Mama.
No,
Not your mother.
So they were
It
saving.
It was a nibble, but not
That's an
the
expression.
They call it a nibble, which is a
I say because
handkerchief.
this is the kind of person she was. You never really got to know her because,
She was already well up there.
And not because, everybody's mother is wonderful, and I'm sure everyone feels deeply, that they had the best, but we have reason to back up our feelings.
To be proud of our...
She bought clothing for us, and I forgot the name of the man that came to the house, and you could charge it to him, and she would pay. But she never ran into debt anywhere. I mean, we paid a little interest, but every nickel, our credit was good no matter what.
Rabbi Kurtz Mildred, did you know?
He's the one that married me.
Yeah, I know.
He was a friend.
He was a friend of our grandfather's.
Of our grandfather. So when I came to Rochester,
There's
and
a
I
book
was-
that mentions our
Wait,
grandfather.
before you go into that, can you fill in with the European background and the family there?
Before you go into that, is he taking pictures as well as recording?
No, he's just recording. I hope.
don't worry about it.
Because we should say here
The bulk of
that
this
it's too
journal.
bad Aunt Betty isn't here. She has a cold and can't be with us. She'll feel badly that she was left out when we see this
She would know a
recording.
lot.
Yeah.
Betty
Betty
would
would,
have a lot of the background
yes.
information.
Let Mildred
You fill
finish
in
what,
now.
Well,
Rabbi.
I remember my mother telling me the background of her grandparents, and her grandmother, her mother came from a quite well-to-do family. It was, I don't know their last name, but it was
Berzovsky.
Berzovsky.
And someone called
And
themselves Bar.
she couldn't become pregnant. They were married for about 7 years. And they used to have like a fortune teller. She went to this fortune teller, and the fortune teller told her that if she could have children, if she married off the first one when she was 13 years old. So she promised this woman that she was going to marry her child off at 13 years old. Well, she proceeded to have 5 daughters, and one was prettier than the other. They were all blondes and blue-eyed. And then her 5th child was our grandmother, and she was dark with brown eyes. And she really felt neglected. Here she's got these beautiful sisters, and she's the dark one. And she, she probably was very attractive because I never saw a picture of her. But what my mother said was that she felt, like she was like the stepchild, like Cinderella, being dark and having all these beautiful children. So she developed asthma. She had a very bad case of asthma. My mother said when you'd walk into the other room, you could hear it was like an organ playing.
Oh.
But these 5 daughters, he married, he was quite well-to-do, and he looked for learned men to marry them all. So the first one he married off to a cantor, and that was the Levy's mother.
Yeah, right.
And the second one he married off was to a rabbi, and that was Celia's father. Remember Celia? She came to Rochester.
Oh,
Oh, yes,
right.
Frida Gordon's,
No, this was the one that
Celia.
came from,
oh, I didn't meet her.
Brought her on a train one time to Rochester
right.
when she came from Europe.
Mhm.
And the third daughter, my mother said, married a very wealthy man, and they moved to White Russia. That was a place where they didn't allow Jews, but if you had a certain skill, they allowed you. So and the fourth one married, that was Frida's mother.
Yeah.
And he was a baker. No, she was a baker, Frida's mother. And he was, you know, like a Talmud, you know, teacher. He was. He wasn't really a teacher. He studied all the time.
The student.
He was a, you know, professional scholar.
Yes. Mhm.
And then the grandmother, he was the handsomest one of all the five son-in-laws, and he was a very educated man, and he was educated not only in Hebrew, but in Russian. And he was like the town scribe. If somebody had to go to Europe, travel, you'd have to have papers made to go from one province to the other. And they would come to him, and he would write the papers for them. And so he got special permission to travel through Russia, where they had scatterings of Jews that had no teachers, and he would take off to these different places to teach the Jewish children. So he'd go off for 1 year and then come back for a few months, and they'd have a child. My grandmother had 11 children, and 3 sets of twins.
Wow.
But they didn't reach maturity.
But they never
Only
reached
4.
maturity, and only 4 reached maturity. And Tante Sarmendel was the oldest. Then there was Uncle Jake,
It was half a twin.
who was half a twin. And then there was Uncle Abe, and then my mother was the baby. And he would go off and come back, and there would be another baby. So
Mildred's mother just celebrated her
her
100th.
100th birthday. And she said our grandfather was known throughout the district, because he went from Russia to Ukraine and all these different places, and he was very well versed, and he could talk to different people in different languages. So he was a very wonderful man. And I remember when I was 3 years old, now this is,
That they mentioned.
yeah, he was written up in this book. I remember when I was 3 years old, and there was a bunch of women crying and carrying on, and they had my grandmother on the floor, and they were making shrouds for her. I never will forget that as long as I live.
When she passed
She
away?
passed away, they
When-
were still.
well,
Yes.
I
she
was 3
still-
years
Oh,
old.
yes.
Mildred was born
In Europe, I can't
Yes.
remember. So I remember when all these women were there making the shrouds, and they had her on the floor. Can you imagine how that must feel for a young child?
That's the way they did it.
They
When my
did.
father died, he was on the floor. With
And when
candles
they
around.
had Revelaya here, Carver,
Yes.
I was
That
shocked.
was their,
I was
that was
really
their
shocked.
custom.
Yes,
The greatest
but
simplicity.
when she passed away.
They had all these women, and I never will forget it, they were washing her. And
Yes.
so the women grabbed me and took
Took
me
you
out.
out, sure.
But I was, fascinated with what was going on.
Well, it was called a mitzvah.
It
When
still
you-
is. It's
Yes.
Heber Kadisha.
Yeah, right,
Yes.
right.
And, but, a 3-year-old child to see this,
leaves a lasting impression.
And did that part of the family, did your mother come then to Canada as well?
No,
to
my
United
mother
States?
went to Georgia,
To Georgia
to Atlanta,
directly,
Georgia.
around the same time?
No, we came in 1924, I believe.
Well, after grandmother
Or
passed
23,
away,
after she passed away. My mother didn't want to leave her father
Mm-hmm.
in Europe, so she married him off to my grandmother, my father's mother.
she was a widow.
She was a widow. So she stayed until her father married her mother-in-law. And
So he wouldn't
It was
leave
all
us.
so
tied
he
up.
wouldn't,
So she
so
could
it,
leave.
because she couldn't leave him and her husband was in this country, so she felt very strange about it, so she married him off to her mother-in-law.
And then came to this
And then she
country.
came to this country.
Now, was she the last of the
Of Mama's family.
to come?
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm. Now we can go to the Gossin side of the family,
Right.
because this took care of my mother's family, the Babucks.
Yes.
And all they had to do was put a C in there and we would have been landed gentry, but they didn't. It was B-A-B-O-K. Now, don't you think they should have put a C in there?
Made it that guy.
But when they came to this,
Believe me, I thought about it.
when the breeds came to this country, they thought Babak was a too Russian name.
Uh-huh.
So they changed it to Freed. One changed it to F-R-E-E-D. The other one changed it to I-E-D.
See, now the story I heard was that when they came here,
They didn't get together.
Uncle Abe and Uncle Jake, when they came here, and I don't know which one looked at the other and said, resign, fried.
No, that's
And
not
the man
the-
said the
no.
name Freed. That's the story I heard.
Dorothy,
No.
there are many people by the name of Freed, and it's because they were freed
Right.
from
Right.
Russian,
That's
Right,
what I
that's
thought.
the
what I
story
thought.
I got.
And
and they couldn't spell their Russian names.
Babak.
That was too difficult for them.
I'm
So
telling
they
you,
would
I
be
know.
even
that's just the
counseled
story I heard.
to use a name.
Or assign the name.
And that's why so many Cohens got the name of Cohen.
And
From
our
their
name-
Cohens
They
before,
were Cans.
but they were Cahans.
Our name got
So you're a
changed
Cahan,
from
and you
Gossin
take the name of
to
Cohen.
Gossin.
Well, no, I think somebody in the family had to shorten it, because the Canadians
see
retained
ya.
the name Goshinsky.
And Celia did that. And Danny Kaye, I discovered, did you know that Danny Kaye was a cousin that we never knew was related to us? When I met cousins from England, they said, do you know that Danny Kaye was a Goshinsky? And I once heard a program that was given about Danny Kaye, and they gave his original name. And when I heard it, I said, well, that sounds like our name was. So he was in the family.
Mhm. What do we know about the Gossin side? Do we know the history in Russia?
Because I've always got
Yes,
mine
my
third or fourth person, so
grandfather-
let's hear what she has to
My
say.
father's father used to have, they called it a smolarnik. That means they lived in a wooded area, and they would make turpentine from something you get from the trees. I think turpentine's made that way. And then he married my mother, and they were living in Valkavis. Now, in my father's family, his father had been married and had a large family and lost his wife. And then he, after she passed, the first wife passed away, he remarried and had another large family. So that we never knew, not till many years later did we know my father's half-brothers. Because the first family, most of those children went to England. They settled in London. We discovered London relatives some years later. One went to Argentina. And then one sister in London made contact with us and visited the United States with her son. And that started us
Two
since
in
then.
Montreal, two
Don't forget.
sisters.
Well, then came later, yes.
Well,
And
but
his
you're
two
talking
brothers.
about brothers and sisters.
Yes, the one brother who settled in Rochester, before he was married, the woman he was going to marry said, "You should not be with a name like Gossinski." And she changed it to Gossin. So when we were still living in Kingston, we were told our name is Gossin. And that's where that name came.
So all they did was take the SKY off, because the Canadian family, for a long time, spelled it with a GU, Gussin, and they took the SKY off. Then they changed it to the GO, which is the way the American branch spelled it. But Mary, you sort of digress a little. There were, there were his children and her children, and so there were the half brothers and sisters. So you get back to where these brothers and sisters were. Now some settled in England, but then there were at least two sisters
Montreal.
that settled in Montreal.
Yes.
And then there was Aunt Maram, who was a sister who settled in the New York area.
Yeah, right.
And then Aunt Levinson was
Right,
married to
in New
Pa's
York.
brother, but his name was Levinson, because these brothers and sisters,
took different
when
names.
they immigrated, they took the first name that maybe somebody ahead of them used. So they took all these different names, and it wasn't until really not too many years ago that we were aware of the different families and how they were related to us. Now you can continue, Mary, because you know the family better than I do.
Did you have contact with all these various
No.
parts of the family?
Our father and our Uncle Abe in Rochester maintained a connection with their brothers and sisters. My Uncle Abe did the writing, and he heard from his family, and he shared it with our father. But our father never shared it with us. They had a very close relationship, and they were in contact, but they never shared it with us. We never knew our cousins. Even in Rochester, there wasn't very much contact with us.
When Mary came from London,
That was the first contact with the English
She-
family.
She and her son came, and the first visit I made to London, the cousin that we had met invited other cousins there. Now we met cousins there whose name was Simmons, but it was just spending a very short time with them, and I did not remember the name of Simmons. But not very long, when I moved to this apartment that I have now in Florida, when the apartment buildings the one that I was in was very new, and we had met at the clubhouse, and on the way back from the clubhouse, there were two women walking towards the new building, and when I caught up to them, I said, "Well, you must be neighbors of mine," because they were headed in that direction. And we started to talk, and one woman, I noticed that she had the English accent. I asked, where are you from? And she said, London. And I spoke about some interesting experience I had had sending a gift to the cousins that I knew in London, and waited for an acknowledgement, which took a long time. And finally, the package came back to me. And when it came back to me, I immediately said, they must have been in the United States when that package reached them. And I was right. So I mentioned that to this woman that I met, and she said, what is their name? And I told her, where do they live? And I said, Hendon. And she said, I know them. She said, my cousin Rose Simmons always talked about her Aunt Mary. And so I said, well, if your cousin Rose Simmons talked about her Aunt Mary Pentel, I said, then she's a cousin of mine. And then that winter, Rose Simmons, who was the wife of our cousin, came to visit, and with her son and daughter-in-law. And when I asked them, well, how did you get the name of Simmons? The answer was that when they came to London, when the first one came to London, he was asked, what is your name? And he said Shimon, which is a Jewish name. And so they wrote down Simmons. And that's where there are Simmons cousins.
Now, Mary, when I met this one relative that's in the LA area, it seems that her father-in-law,
Yes.
the Simmons, always spoke, and her husband, I
That would
guess,
be
is
grandfather.
whatever.
Her grandfather.
her grandfather, is by marriage,
Yeah.
always spoke of going every Sunday to visit this Aunt Mary, who was a half-sister.
Yes.
They were not
Yes,
full
oh,
brother and
this-
sister.
yes.
Oh,
The
there were three
Simmons.
sets, I guess.
Yeah.
as we-
Yeah, his, hers, and theirs.
Yes.
Uh-huh,
That's
uh-huh.
right.
Can I interject for a second? David and I believe have to go in a couple minutes. For just maybe your closing comments,
Yes.
if you have any words
Important.
of advice to the younger generation or anything,
Well, I'm going to say something, because
ahead.
Millie might not remember to say it. Millie has a relative of ours who at one point was talking to our Aunt Goldie, her mother, and he did pretty much what we're doing now, and he recorded a lot of the family names and background and sort of things of interest going to the roots situation.
Right.
This cousin keeps in touch with Millie periodically, see how Aunt Goldie is doing, and Millie is going to contact this cousin and try to get a tape of what he has, because he has more or less of a chronological order of the family, the names and places and whatnot. Of course, nobody would know us, we're too many.
His grandpa, no, it's his grandpa was principal of the Yeshiva College in Chicago.
Oh, yes.
Well, I know that family, I met them.
The Bars.
I looked for them. We went to Chicago for the World's Fair, and I was determined to see these cousins, to find them. His name was Bar, Nathan Bar.
He was the principal of the Yeshiva
Yes.
College.
Yes, and
I went.
I had no address, but we were with another couple, and the man, the other couple who was with us, when I told him about this cousin's background, he said, I'll go to a Jewish bookstore and I will find him. And we did, and we met, we saw them.
Lovely
And
couple.
a part of his family lived in Milwaukee,
Yeah, one of his daughters.
Minneapolis,
Yeah, we have cousins
a
in
son and a daughter.
Milwaukee, Goldie. She's
Yes.
named after the same grandmother
As your mother.
as my mother.
And he lived in Chicago. There's a lot of educated, very highly educated people in our family.
Well, Mama's family were all
Educated.
all
yes.
the cultured,
Oh,
educated people, right. Our father's family came from money,
Well, they were more industrial.
yes, and very wealthy, but they didn't have the prestigious background that Mama's family had. Because anyone who was at all in commercial or in business, no matter how bright their background was, they weren't as considered as elite as the intellectuals. And Mama's family were all the intellectuals.
Well, don't forget that when her mother came to this country, she read and wrote, right? English.
Well, at an advanced
went to
age,
school.
she used to give readings to a group in Miami, and they meet in the park, and
used
she
to
would
read.
give readings to
read.
them.
Is that right?
She
Yes.
could read and write English, and she came from Europe.
And she never went to school.
And never, yeah, right, never went to learn it.
I want to say this, and I don't know whether it's important or not, but when I read some of the books of Jewish background and see some of the films, I don't enjoy them, because to me, that's not showing the type of family that was
We came from.
this, that we came from, that manners and good speech were stressed, and there was no crudeness.
No. We were
It was all
cultured.
educational minded. The important thing was to get schooling, to be a good scholar.
There was no money. Money was secondary.
Material
Nobody
things were
said,
not as important.
become a doctor so you can earn money, or do this
Yes,
to
that
earn
changed.
money.
That-
But get an
that-
education, that was important in our family.
And I must add one more note. Shep and I spent an overnight in England, and that was primarily because I wanted to meet this celebrated Aunt Mary that everybody else in Rochester had met and I hadn't, because I was in Iowa. And no, I was in California at the time. So we had this overnight, and this cousin Joe Pinto picked us up at the airport, and Shep is nudging me, ask him. And I said, be quiet, but no, ask him. So I asked him, and I said, well, Joe, I always said to my husband that we have at least 50 first cousins in London, England alone. And this very British voice says, that's right. And I said, what did you say? And he says, that's right. There was so many families in England that we still don't know, and they all had a number of
Well,
children.
Joe, his
So-
sisters,
Yeah, so that we had
Yes.
we had over 50 first cousins in London alone. One family in Montreal, the Moskowitzes,
Moskowitz.
they had like 10 or 12 with two sets of twins. Mary, you would know that because I never met these
Not
people.
Moskowitz. They didn't have 10 or 12.
Albert?
Albert.
They had the
Oh,
10 or
yes.
12?
And he was a Hazen Sheikh, too.
Yeah. So
Which
we
is
are
someone
loaded
with
with family
education.
that if we ever wanted to do a roots, I think that after we got through the first generation, we'd probably quit. We'd be afraid. We'd be afraid of having a convention.
Well, there's so
but
many
we-
records that are lost to do.
Yes.
Roots,
I think if you
unfortunately.
talk long enough to a good number of people, you will find that one way or another, if you're in a group of 50 people, I think that you would find that one is related to us one way or another. Because we have so many relatives.
So it's spread out.
They're all spread out, and of course, our parents were close. I know when I visit at the Gossins, and I had listening ears, this big, I would hear my father and my uncle talk about the various sisters and brothers, but they never conveyed it to us. They never made any effort for us to know our family. Not
on
even the
the
3
Gossin
cousins in
side.
Rochester. We grew up and we didn't have that much contact with our own 3 cousins in Rochester. I didn't, and Bjorn
Garson
didn't either.
Yeah, that's
Well,
because of
Garson in later
age.
years,
Garson.
in later years, not as he was growing up,
Well, I think we have to
when he
kind
went to
of,
college.
Sign
wrap
off.
ourselves up, but
Yes.
I think we need to regard this sort of as a work in progress. And
Right.
so we can-
We're gonna
We can
continue
sit down
June.
with Aunt Betty and continue.
Oh,
this.
Betty would be
I think-
great.
I think it's important.
Betty was at an
What
age
book
to
is it
remember a
where
lot.
ancients are?
Next year in Irvine.
What's the title?
That's right, it is next year. No, let's make it this year, we're practically there.
Because
Okay.
Rabbi
6 months.
Kurtz
What's the
was
name
there,
of it?
Yeah.
Rabbi Kurtz was
Yeah.
there, and it mentioned, there is a
This doctor in New York, Hannon has the book.
Yes.
Hannon has it?
Hannon has
Okay, I think my kid is,
Grandfather is
Yeah.
missing.
You've gotta go.
yeah.
Yeah.